You're watching the Air and Space Channel.
In October of 1944, with the Allies pushing east towards Berlin, Germany launches an assault in the Ardennes Forest. During the Battle of the Bulge, Nazi forces attempt to push American, British, and Canadian troops off the continent of Europe. On the other side of the world, Japan launches its own counteroffensive in the Pacific. Theirs is unlike anything America has seen before. Japanese aircraft head straight towards U.S. destroyers, battleships, and aircraft carriers, flown by men prepared to sacrifice their own lives. It is known as Kamikaze, where pilots turn their planes into missiles. Suicide missions intended to cripple the American war machine as they inch closer towards the heart of Japan. These pilots follow the rule of divine wind. Loyal to the Emperor and their homeland, they are willing to die for both. Their weapons are their bodies. Their targets are American ships, pilots, and sailors. This is a story from two different perspectives, from the men willing to die for their country, and from the men determined to stop them. By 1944, the Empire of Japan is in a state of retreat. The area in which they hoped to create a Greater Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere is now a distant memory. The spirit of late 1941, when the land of the rising sun seemed invincible, has vanished. Since America's victory at Midway, the United States takes back island after island from Hirohito's forces. Japanese fighter aircraft are outnumbered by more modern American planes, being produced from the factories in droves. Experienced Japanese pilots are in short supply. In addition, the proximity fuse is utilized, making it almost impossible for Japanese bombers to get anywhere near U.S. naval vessels. No longer do they control the Pacific with an iron fist. By January of 1944, even those in the top circles of Japanese power have concluded that the war is lost. For a nation dependent on imports, they are denied the raw materials desperately needed to continue the war. Japanese merchant ships carrying oil, coal, and other goods are either attacked from the sky or torpedoed by American submarines. Production in Japan is slashed to shreds. To make matters worse, a naval blockade is causing severe shortages in food and materials, resulting in mass starvation. On paper, the war is all but won by the United States.
Really, by the fall of 1944, it's clear from Hirohito's recent biographers who've really studied the Japanese documents, by the fall of 44, he knew Japan had lost the war. But surrender was not on the table because of this notion of honor, and he was also really obsessed with protecting the sort of royal regalia, the symbols of the emperor's authority. And, you know, all through the summer of 45, the Japanese press was running what Hirohito's biographer Herbert Bix called the Die for the Emperor campaign. I mean, this was the message to the whole society.
As the American invasion forces got closer and closer to the homeland, it became an even bigger and more purposeful strategy to not necessarily to win the war, but to make the cost of getting closer and closer to the Japanese homeland so great that they'd be able to achieve a negotiated peace.
For America, the road to Tokyo has been a bloody affair, with thousands of troops killed in the process. The Japanese proved themselves to be warriors, fighting until their last breath, based on a sacred samurai code known as Bushido. Surrender is not an option for its citizens, who are told that they will be shamed forever if they give in to the Americans.
The Army and Marines had certainly encountered this in some of the islands that were taken where Japanese civilians committed suicide rather than be taken prisoner, and they were essentially told and ordered to, oh, you don't know what's going to happen to you, and it's part of this honor not to be taken prisoners. So there had been this sort of preview of the same mentality that American forces had encountered already.
United States generals realized that if the resistance on these islands is this fierce, the invasion of Japan itself could be the mother of all bloodbaths.
The rules of war were that you fought until your last breath, and that was expected of your enemy as well. So the concept of surrendering was something that the Japanese military did not recognize or respect. And it had big consequences on both sides during the conflict, that it was no quarter on both sides.
With the acquisition of island outposts by U.S. forces, landing strips are prepared for the arrival of the massive B-29 superfortress. Being twice the size and having twice the range of the B-17, this gigantic bomber is what America hopes will be the deciding factor in the Pacific, having the capability of flying over Yokohama, Nagoya, and the capital city of Tokyo, allowing for a massive bombardment of the Japanese home islands.
Massed B-29 attacks, hundreds of bombers flying in close formation, dropping incendiaries, were extraordinarily effective in burning Japanese cities. There's no question about that. The attack in Tokyo, again, this is conventional bombs, incendiaries, burned square miles of the city, did huge amount of damage, probably caused 100,000 or so civilian deaths, rivaling what possibly even exceeding what the atomic bombs did.
If the war can be won from the air, hopefully a D-Day style invasion in the Pacific can be avoided. Yet, despite all the deaths and starvation throughout Japan, its military still refuses to acquiesce to the demands of an unconditional surrender. By mid-1944, with American forces ready to take back the Philippines, it becomes clear that the people of Japan will not accept defeat without a fight to the death. Their loyalty is to Emperor Hirohito, and the idea of foreigners occupying the homeland is a concept completely alien to them. They would rather die than surrender to America. It is this belief system that allows the kamikaze fighter to emerge.
A lot of people who've written about the kamikaze suggest that there's some origins in the Shinto religion and the samurai code, and I think that's undeniably true, but it's also stretching it. That there was this, certainly a Japanese martial tradition, there was this notion of personal loyalty to the emperor, and that was clearly driving it. Hirohito himself was very impressed and very supportive of the whole idea of these special attack forces, and thought, well, this is the supreme expression of the devotion of the Japanese people to their emperor personally. That's how he viewed it.
In order to protect a perimeter of islands giving America the ability to bomb Japan, squadrons of volunteers begin enlisting for their own version of a divine wind against the United States.
A decision was made, and basically it was during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, that the best chance they had of taking out an American fleet, an American invasion fleet, was to purposely crash their aircraft into these ships.
Unable to sink numerically superior aircraft carriers through traditional methods, they instead must resort to the doctrine of kamikaze.
If this had been the United States and the Japanese were advancing on our homeland, and we had disadvantages in terms of resources, aircraft, and pilots, and wanted to fend off an advancing enemy, certainly, anything becomes possible.
Under the leadership of Admiral Onishi, thousands of men trained for what will be their last mission. A true believer in the Bushido Code, Onishi, with the Emperor's blessing, begins organizing a suicidal war plan. The Oka, a piloted rocket bomb, is authorized along with a human torpedo known as the Kai-10, as weapons to be used against American ships.
There were a small number of special purpose kamikaze aircraft built, the most famous of which was the so-called Cherry Blossom, which was basically a bomb with stubby wings and a cockpit welded on top and a solid rocket motor, and this was dropped from the bomber. The solid rocket motor would be used to accelerate this into a dive approaching 600 miles per hour, so that was particularly difficult to counter when you had such a high terminal speed.
These are in addition to the thousands of kamikaze pilots being trained for their final act in uniform. The goal is simple: fly straight into American ships, and hopefully, with the mixture of fire and gasoline, the explosion causes the vessel to sink.
One pilot and one plane can take out a ship that may have 300 sailors, 500, maybe as many as 3,000 sailors with one well-placed hit. And in a number of occasions they did that or came close to doing it on many others.
And because the decks of American aircraft carriers are made of wood, the probability of a ship going down is even more likely. A key target then for the kamikaze pilots is the central deck elevator, believing that a successful attack can, at the very least, disable the carrier. The advantages of the kamikaze are numerous. Pilots need very little training. Obsolete aircraft can be used, and even if planes are hit by a proximity-fused shell, the momentum can hopefully keep the aircraft on target. The average kamikaze pilot is given a 1-week crash course in suicide attacks. 2 days are spent practicing takeoffs, another 2 to study formation flying, with the last 3 days spent on how to strike a target successfully.
It was a case where some very young pilots were kind of dragooned into doing this. Some older, experienced pilots who were gung-ho were ready to go and do it and maybe had to be restrained, but it went all along the spectrum, I think.
Crash diving, however, is not as simple as it may appear on paper. The powerful lift generated from the high winds makes it difficult to keep the nose of an aircraft on target. Also, there is the strong possibility of pilots blacking out from the heavy gravitational forces when they come crashing down. This entire strategy is a huge gamble, but for the Japanese, with their cities being destroyed, it is their only card left to play. By 1944, as the Americans are set to take back the Philippines in the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the first waves of kamikaze attacks are unleashed. Before taking off, Admiral Onishi tells his men as they drink sake, "You are already gods, without earthly desires. Your own crash dive is not in vain. Regrettably, we will not be able to tell you the results, but I shall watch your efforts in the end and report your deeds to the throne." On October 25th, a special attack unit led by Lieutenant Yukio Seki spots an American ship, the St. Lo. Diving straight down, his aircraft hits the ship's deck, exploding like a fireball. Going right through its wooden frame, subsequent explosions begin interacting with torpedoes and bombs on board the vessel, and a new chapter in Second World War history begins.
Then it struck. They call it kamikaze, meaning the divine tempest. We call them suicide planes, manned by pilots wearing the ceremonial red sash of the Kamikaze Corps. They specialize in one-way trips. Their destination, the deck or hull of any American ship onto which plane, bombs, burning gasoline, and red-sashed pilot can crash.
Waves of kamikaze attacks are given the green light by Onishi, with targets not being limited to just strictly naval vessels. With the bombardment of Japanese cities by B-29 superfortresses, orders are given to attack these bombers with the same ferocity. The results prove disappointing. With the B-29's defensive armament that includes remote-controlled gun turrets, kamikaze planes are unable to stop these massive bombers from pulverizing the land of the rising sun.
The Japanese pilots would call them ice castles because they were so far up, and there was no need to camouflage the planes because their elevation was to keep them from having Japanese planes assault them. It was only when tactics changed, when there was a move to more low-level bombing, that the Japanese planes were able to attack them. Even then, there were many instances where the B-29s could actually outrun a Japanese fighter aircraft, was faster than the aircraft that was trying to pursue them.
And with a scorched earth strategy being carried out under the auspices of General Curtis LeMay, the kamikaze fighter is in a race against the clock. Despite the destruction these tactics are having on American ships, the United States government does not retreat. Their final push to Tokyo will not be derailed, no matter what the cost. So for the next 10 months, American servicemen accept the possibility that today could be their very last.
For the kamikazes, psychologically, I don't think they were prepared at all. It just was such a foreign concept to these young guys, on a ship or in the air, to see somebody who would purposely sacrifice themselves as a way of trying to win a battle. It just was unimaginable to them.
I think that probably the greatest effectiveness of the kamikazes was that it was so incomprehensible to the American military leadership, American society, American understanding. And it did, I mean, don't get me wrong, there was a very real material effect of the kamikaze attacks, but I think the psychological effect really was quite powerful. That it was so hard for American soldiers and sailors and airmen to get their minds around this mentality of people who were willing to do this. And of course, it was very hard to answer. I mean, normally a lot of what air defense and self-defense in general is based on is the idea that this guy is trying to save his life, is trying to avoid being hit, doing something crazy. So it was very hard to answer this.
Hopefully, with the hundreds of guns, rockets, and shells on board destroyers, cruisers, frigates, and battleships, these sailors can shoot down the kamikaze before it is too late. In dealing with this menace, a strategy known as the Big Blue Blanket is employed by naval aviator John Thatch. The plan calls for around-the-clock surveillance by fighter planes over the American fleet, increased attacks on Japanese airfields, and stationing destroyer escorts 50 miles away from the main body to alert the other ships of any approaching Japanese aircraft.
Developing this whole system of radar picket ships that would spot the incoming kamikaze forces, keeping air patrols deployed really around the clock during some of the operations to try to intercept them. So still some did get through. Even in the Battle of Okinawa, it was mainly small ships, American ships, that were sunk. There were no large carriers or battleships that were actually really put out of action and were sunk by the kamikaze attacks.
This strategy proved successful in disrupting the kamikaze. With Japan in a weakened state, skilled pilots become scarce. As a result, gunmen are finding it easier to shoot down oncoming planes being manned by inexperienced pilots. Despite the toll suicide attacks are taking on soldiers' psyches and lives, most notably on the USS Bunker Hill and the USS Franklin, where hundreds of servicemen are killed, the kamikaze is facing an equally fierce counterstrike.
Ultimately, it was the American military forces were so overwhelmingly powerful, this wasn't going to stop them. It could cause a lot of casualties, it could inflict a lot of pain along the way, but it wasn't sufficient at any point to even derail American strategic decisions. It caused tactical redeployments, it caused an American diversion of forces to try to deal with the kamikazes, but it couldn't alter American strategy.
The attacks reached their zenith during the battle for Okinawa, where hundreds of suicide planes are used in this pivotal conflict.
They did cause a lot of casualties. The climax was probably the Battle of Okinawa, where close to 2,000 kamikaze attacks took place.
A joint order is written by both the Japanese Army and Navy, establishing suicide as an official policy. This results in 30 American ships sunk and 300 badly damaged in the fight for Okinawa. In the end, the United States takes the island, but only after 12,000 American and 110,000 Japanese deaths. The effect of the kamikaze is being felt in Washington, D.C., where military and civilian planners decide what to do with Japan. Even with the unprecedented bombardment of their cities by B-29s, with the death toll being in the hundreds of thousands, the demand for an unconditional surrender is still not being met. Kamikaze missions, in addition to the fierce resistance offered on Okinawa and Iwo Jima, make generals like George Marshall favor the use of an atomic bomb. The Japanese had demonstrated in each case they would not surrender, said the general. We had to end the war. We had to save American lives. Since President Harry Truman takes office following the death of Franklin Roosevelt, American casualties reached nearly half the total of 3 years of battling against the Japanese in just 3 months.
It was something to contemplate. I remember the terrible anxiety through which the people in Washington went, and I was one of them, wondering what would happen when we attempted to take the main islands of Japan.
Conventional wisdom leads the commander-in-chief to believe that the casualties resulting from a mainland invasion of Japan could be enormous, possibly in excess of 1 million men. For that reason, the decision to drop the first atomic bomb in history is approved by the president. On August 6th, the first nuclear weapon in history is used on the city of Hiroshima, and days later, a second bomb is dropped on the city of Nagasaki. After unprecedented carnage, the demand for an unconditional surrender is finally met. With the defeat of the Japanese comes the defeat of the kamikaze. The impact of these suicide attacks is still hotly debated.
At the time, in 1945, it was seen as a barbarian approach to warfare, an unheard of approach to warfare. 60 years later, you can start to equivocate and say, well, listen, they had to do this. It was in their interest and it was an honorable tactic.
The ships that were sunk as a result of kamikaze planes vary from the mid-30s to the high 50s. Approximately over 4,000 sailors were killed and another 4,000 wounded. However, the entire goal of the kamikaze backfires, causing war planners who may have still been on the fence in terms of whether to drop the atomic bomb or not, to support a nuclear attack on Japan. It was a strategy that grossly underestimated America's resolve in seeking an unconditional surrender from the land of the rising sun. For that reason, no number of suicidal pilots could have stopped the United States' war machine from achieving total victory.
You're watching the Air and Space Channel.